Welcome to the belonging place, Ronell. I'm really excited to have you here. So we're just gonna start off with you kind of telling us a little bit about yourself, and yeah, just I don't want you to talk about like what you've done or what you have. Part of the purpose of the Belonging Place podcast is to have our guests introduce themselves just like in the middle of their story or like on the way, like they're becoming, right? Not necessarily their arrival. So, without that, I'm going to let you jump in wherever you want to just kind of tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Kylee, for having me. I am excited to participate in this and to talk with you today. So, describe myself. I always start here actually. I'm a person who loves people. Like I look at it and it doesn't matter what facet of life I'm in, whether that's work, family, but people for me are just such an important part of life. And so when I think about who I am, it's really about how I engage with people, how, just like every aspect, thinking, talking, acting, like all those things, right? And it's one of the reasons why when people ask me like what I do, and I say, well, first and foremost, I'm a husband and father because those are the most important people in my life. And so if people want to know who I am, like that, like that's it. Like you can go learn about the other things that I do some other place.
Yeah.
But the other thing I would say too about who I am, I am a very religious person, and so part of when I think about who I am, and not just me, but maybe I kind of project this on other people, but I believe it is that I'm a child of God, and so is everybody else around me. It doesn't matter what their religious beliefs are, and so that's something that really is something that I hold dear and speaks to me. And because of that, I think it helps me to interact with people in a different way because I really work hard, not perfect at it, but trying to see people in that view.
Love that.
Um, and so that's something that's really critical to me. And then I would say I am a very curious person. Like learning from me is something that I think deeply about. Often when I'm either like guest lecturing and things like that, if I'm giving folks like my tips for life, I'm like don't think about the money you're going to make or the title you're going to have, but if you can focus on learning, you're always going to feel motivated because that's the biggest part about anything that you do is like are you continuing to learn? Because I just hate stagnating.
Yeah.
Being comfortable for me is like, and maybe I should get there at some point, but being comfortable for me is not something I'm doing right now.
Yeah. Well, being
So
uncomfortable means growth, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And so
It's so funny. The other day I took a little tour at Domo. I don't know that much about Domo,
yeah,
but I
yeah.
know people that work there. But you know the saying, like, be the dumbest person in the room. Check. I was by far like the amount of growth and learning in like that 2 or 3 hours of sitting there. I barely understood. It was like Charlie Brown's teacher talking, right? Because they were talking about data analytics and stuff, but different companies that were using them came up and were talking and learning about those companies and stuff. And I like, yes, this
Yeah,
idea of like, if you're the smartest person in the room, you think you know everything, there's nowhere to go from there, right?
yeah. So that's how I describe myself. If you want to know who I am, like that's who I am, And there's other aspects of me. Obviously, visually, you can see I'm a person of color, and I think that's something that I believe in strongly. Is like ethnic or cultural identity is a very important part of who we are, and I think that makes the world a better place. Especially when you can kind of integrate and figure out the commonalities and also the differences, because there's so much power in both of those. And so it's something that I believe in really strongly.
Well, Ronell, there are some things about who you are we can't see by the way that you look. For example, tell us a little bit about like you have a pretty multicultural background,
Yeah,
right?
I
Yeah.
do. So, I growing up. So when most people meet me, they're like, "Oh, they will assume that I'm American." But one of the things that I've been working on for the last several years is getting actually my citizenship. And where does that stem from? Well, I was born in Germany, lived there for 7 or almost 8 years, and my parents were never married. So I grew up as a Jamaican citizen for the last, 40 plus years of my life. And so, and then I also speak German. And so it kind of, you add those things into it. So, but when people meet me, they just assume like, oh yeah, you're American, And we know you speak English. You probably don't speak any other foreign languages. um, but it's actually interesting. The more I've dug into it, one time I actually was, when I used to have facial hair, I saw red hair growing in, and I was like, where does this come from? And then talking to my mom, and then now doing some DNA testing, but talking to my mom at that point, she was like, oh yeah, we have Scottish ancestors.
Okay.
And so, it's fun to look at DNA even and kind of think about it. But my grandfather's half Chinese and half Syrian, and so it's like you start to kind of go even deeper. You're like, yeah, and so it's just really fascinating. So when people look at my DNA chart, they're like, you kind of have every part covered. I'm like, yeah, I kind of have every continent probably touching. So, but yeah, those are just things about me
Yeah.
that you can't see.
Yeah, I love that.
So
I'm interested. So that's just a drop in the bucket for our listeners of just like some of who you are,
yeah,
right? Um we I really want to like dive into this idea of belonging. I have chosen the title of The Belonging Place. I worked at a wilderness program for a few years as a therapist there called Anasazi. And in the language there was, they talked about the being in a belonging place, a place where you feel seen, where you matter, where you're cared for, right?
mhm.
In my definition of that, where you can grow, where you feel healthy, where you feel connected, where you can fail, right? I'm curious for you, like when we talk about belonging or the opposite of that, right? Not belonging or being like othered. I would love to hear your thoughts about that and like what that means to you.
Yeah. It's the word belonging to me is kind of taking on a bigger meaning in my life. I mean, there's so many different ways I've talked about it, whether it's inclusion or just kind of feeling comfortable in your own skin. But when I think of the word belonging, I find it being one of those things where I can naturally be who I am, be myself, like and feel allowing myself to feel to be vulnerable in the things that I say, or just engaging with people around me. It's one of the things that when I look back over my life, one of the things that I found is that I grew up in three countries by the time I was 10, right? So when you live in three different countries, one of the things you realize is that you have to learn cultures, people, and sometimes languages, right? And even though I was in the US, but also then lived in England, yeah, I'm speaking English, but the words they use in England are different, right? And so, but one of the things that I learned from that experience is that it gave me a strong curiosity about people and about why people do what they do and why they're interested in certain things. And it wasn't out of a sense of judgment. It was more of like, I'm just curious, right? And that's what I think for me, belonging has always been a natural curiosity about people, because when I've done that, it's allowed me to create space for a variety of people,
Right.
right? And in the same vein, I would like that for myself,
Yes.
right? And so for me, like, I think about it in terms of having been in places where I felt like I didn't belong. I remember when we first moved back to Utah 7 years ago, we were at a restaurant. I can't remember where we were, but my daughter said, Dad, why are those people staring at us? And I started to think, I was like, oh, yeah, I'm back in Utah. I'm not very common in Utah. And so I had to tell my daughters and my kids, like, hey, this will potentially happen to you, where you'll be in spaces where people will stare at you or maybe like want to touch your hair or kind of like all these things, right? Which are, and for me, those are like, doesn't it, that's the othering part of it. Like, I don't feel like I'm being included in the space because people are like, well, you're different. I'm like, well, yeah, I know I'm different. But it's one of the things that I spend a lot of time trying to make sure that when people are around me, that they don't feel that, because when they don't feel that, they're then they're able to be themselves. They're able to let their walls down and like talk about things, or feel like they can engage in different conversations or just act themselves, so they don't have to feel like I have to act in a certain way for somebody to, so to speak, accept me for who I am, right?
Yeah, let me ask you a little bit about that. So, I think that for a lot of people, the way that they see the world and the way they put things out in the world, I think there's this hope that that will come back, right? So you just
Mhm.
said, I'm looking at people, I'm curious about cultures and who they are. I'm hoping that is coming back, right? And when that doesn't come back, what do you do? Like, what do you do for yourself? What do you do in your home for your family? I'm curious about how you what's the story that we tell ourselves
Yeah.
when this happens, right?
And it's not easy. I think I expect when I'm giving, you want it back. But what I've learned over the years is for me is I need to I find the people like first and foremost, it's my family. I love spending time in that nuclear unit for me, but it gives me time and focus in an area where I can be myself, right? My kids will know that my kids know this a lot. Like when I do something wrong, maybe I yelled or something like that, I go and apologize because it's just a natural. I'm like, hey, I'm as vulnerable and as human as anybody else, right? But the other thing is just like finding groups, finding community in that sense. A friend of mine, he started pulling together. Right now it's the six of us, but we're six black men who just kind of get together and have dinner and just talk about things that are going on, and now we're starting to do different things together, just whether that's hanging out, but going to lunches, but building that community with people that I feel like, oh, I can just be myself,
Oh, love that.
right? The other thing is like my brother lives here and he lives down in Spanish Fork, and so one of the things, and then a really good friend of ours from North Carolina lives here close too. So we've decided, hey, we're gonna go together once a week and hang out. So finding those your people, I think sometimes we often think like it's you have like if people aren't accepting you, you can either be angry or upset about it. And for me, I'm like, wow, that's just a waste of my energy.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, I want to go find,
Control them.
yeah, I can't
Yeah.
control them. So I'm gonna go find people that I like to be around, or do things that give me joy.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so like whether it's reading or I spend time coach. So for me, one of the great ways that I do it as well. So the things that I mentioned, but I grew up playing soccer. I'm a huge soccer fan. And so I love to give back in my community by coaching soccer. And so it's actually interesting. I don't care about winning or losing. And sometimes people are like, "What?" I'm like, "It's good." I'm like, "Yeah." Like it's like when I played soccer, we won. I'm like I can't really help other people win, other than I can coach them and teach them right skills. But it's really not about that. It's about with these kids that I get to coach. Now I only have a boys team, we used to have a girls team, but it's about bringing these kids together from different schools and different backgrounds and helping them to figure out how they respect each other and be kind to each other. And then because of that, the friendships are formed. And I've seen this happen. Like my daughter, who's a junior in high school, some of the girls she played with are at American Fork High School or at Lone Peak. But when they see each other, it's like, long lost siblings who haven't seen each other in years because the whole focus was building that connection.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
I want to focus a little bit on that because anybody who knows me who's listened to any podcast that I've been on recently or whatever, I am pretty obsessed with the idea of resilience, building resilience, and the combination that it has with community connection and the ability to be resilient, right? Um, so there was a book about 10 years ago that was really big called Grit.
yep.
I don't know if you, yeah. So Angela Duckworth wrote this book that came out that basically talked about, Steve Young is actually in it. Um, that just overall, she talks about this idea that like doing something hard, particularly something that like you don't already know that you have to kind of learn and grow. So whether that's learning a language, she talks about playing soccer like over a 2-year period of time. So that can be really anything. I
Yeah.
think in group dynamics, there's a whole other thing that's added, but builds this crazy sense of not just belonging, like you said, like I have something that we have in common, but also like has huge fruits for like the future. She started doing studies saying like if kids in high school build some resilience over 2 years, they're highly likely to be able to finish their freshman year of college.
Yeah.
And the correlation is also opposite, right? Kids that are not learning how to be resilient are not necessarily even making it to college, let alone through and in like the college equivalent, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of kids today go to like vocational schools or like other things, but the ability to go do that thing is predicated on the ability as we're younger to do hard things, right? So I love that one of the things that you are putting energy in as far as a belonging place also has these crazy other positive like dividends, not just for your kids, but I imagine for you as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It has been for me. I mean, one of the greatest joys. I mean, I remember when my daughter's team, because when around 16, if you're playing a soccer, you either have to kind of decide if you want to continue or not. And the group of girls decided not to. And for me, it was like it was an emotional moment, right? And I remember all these girls were taking pictures and were crying. And like now I see them and they come up and parents, like all these parents are usually like, why are these girls hugging this man? Probably because I'm like, but I'm like, all these girls, I love these girls. But it's been interesting because I've seen my a lot of their parents have said the moments that they spent with you, well, they'll cherish for the rest of their life. Like these girls miss that because of who they became in those moments,
Yeah.
right? And you don't ever realize the impact you have on people. But it's one of the things I always hold close to me because it was I look back and now I have boys now and I have 10, 15, 11-year-old boys, right?
That's funny.
And yeah, they're great. But I have some of them are new, some of them have been with me since they were 4, right? And all these parents are like, they just love you because you, because I don't hold back. I'm not mean, but I'm like, no, I'm gonna just
Boundaries
there's
just
boundaries where they talk and and how you treat each other is super important to me. And I'm like, I don't like if you're celebrating when we're up like 10-0 and you're taunting other players, like I don't have any patience for that. But it's been something that I've looked at as a way of like, hey, this is how you have to learn how to be with people and be around people. That's a way where you're always I feel like you're always connecting.
Yeah.
Like even on a soccer field, you're all like you're playing against another team, you're always connecting because how you manage yourself and what you project or how you're playing impacts other people, your team, right? And so it's something that I've put a lot of not probably a lot of mental energy into, but that kind of thinking kind of permeates my life of like, I never want anybody to ever have an experience with me that's a negative experience. And if they do, I want to know why.
Yeah.
Because I never want them to walk away feeling like I did something intentional
Right.
to hurt them.
Yeah.
Right.
Can I dig into that a little bit? You talked in talking about the soccer and the boys and even the girls, this impact that you clearly know and they've told you, parents have told
Yeah.
you you've made. I would love to flip that script.
Okay.
I'm curious, Ronell, in your life, if there's any particular mentor, friend, person, pivotal moments in your life where that also happened to you. Like you were able to have this impactful moment. It doesn't have to be positive, it can be negative, either way. But I'm interested in you talked about this idea of belonging kind of, and the way that I see it sometimes is tapping people into our lives.
Mhm.
And then if they choose us back, then we're together,
Yeah.
right? Like, but there is this conscientious, or maybe it's not conscious, but there is this, you can tap people into your life, but if they don't choose you back, then they're not really in your belonging place,
Yeah.
right? Are there any people, stories, things that like really impacted you, pivotal moments as far as your belonging or not belonging?
When so I moved from England when I was 16 back to the United States. We moved to North Carolina. And it was, as a 16-year-old, so everybody in England graduates at 16. So when I moved back, I didn't go to high school, right? So like that's a natural place where you would meet people, especially as a young 16-year-old. And so my brother and I, we somehow where we lived, especially as a part of our church, our religion, we were able to kind of meet some folks. And it's interesting. We actually just talking about this last week at lunch with my friend Randy. Like we thought all these group of boys already knew each other, but my friend Randy, it was his first time being integrated into this group as well.
Okay.
And then me and my brother, my older brother, he's a year and a half older than I am, but then we joined this group as well. So there's like probably like I think there's like 11, 12 of us, and it was one of those things where I was like, okay, are they welcoming me in? Will this be a long term thing? But it has literally been one of the biggest things that I've cherished in my life because some of them still live in North Carolina, right? Most of them actually still live in North Carolina. But when we get back together, it's like it's that bond that we created, right? There are so many things. I mean, you could think about like 11-year-old boys, like 11 teenage boys hanging out. Like we did all sorts of
It's the
stuff.
same age as the soccer kids that we were
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about. Yeah.
So, but so we were 16, right? So, but we're in our teenagers, and it's just like one of those things where I remember, um, feeling okay, do I fit and will I fit? Not only was it like more of an ethnic thing for me, but I also had a British accent. So people thought I was like faking a British accent. And I was like, no, this
Too
is
cool for school. Yeah.
yeah,
Too posh.
this is it was real. And I don't have one now because I think I forced it out because I was like, okay, this can't go on for forever. But that was one of the big ones for me was like when that happened. And then I remember I was at a camp and the story of me going to college, I didn't know how I was going to go to college because my parents, very low income. And it was like, I would have to figure out how I was going to be able to afford to go, which is totally fine. But I was like, I'm not sure how it's going to happen. I went to this summer camp and one of the guys there was like, hey, his name was Ross Wall. And he was like, you need to come to school we're going. And so Southern Virginia. So that's why I went to Southern Virginia for a year. But it was his persistence. Like, he's like, I believe you need to be here. He's like, and I was like, oh, but he pulled me into this group of people. And there's only like a couple hundred of us there at the beginning of this university, but that group is such a foundational group for me because, but it was him specifically. He was the one who said, "Hey, I think you need to be here. I see you and I see your potential. I think I see what you can give, not to just like the university, but just you as a person." And that was huge for me because I hadn't really had anybody like either tap me like that before or kind of look at me in that way. And that changed a lot of things for me. I mean, it kind of put me in the path of like obviously college, but also in kind of recognizing that I had a lot to offer.
Yeah.
Right. And
Love
so
that.
so that was like those are kind of two ones that I think of, and there's been a lot since then that I look back and think about where I've been like over the last 3 years. I had a bunch of people reach out to me and said, "Hey, would you be interested in sharing your thoughts about being a person of color or a Black person in a community where there aren't many people like you?" And initially I was like, "Okay, do I want to do this or not?"
Right.
Because it's like you're putting yourself,
Because then you become
yeah.
a representative of that. Yeah.
And one of the things I've always said, like, "Hey, these are my thoughts. I'm not speaking for the broader community." Right. But it was interesting because I've had so many like amazing relationships that have come out of that, and so many opportunities to engage with people on it, whether it's religious speaking opportunities or business speaking opportunities. Like it's been fascinating to think of people that are interested in learning, like, well, what has been your journey, and what do you think we can do to make this better?
Right.
Right? Because in all intents and purposes, it still comes back to this idea of like we don't know people. One of the things, the first thing I did was actually here in Highland. Actually, interesting enough, somebody a couple days ago texted me. Was like, "Hey," they said like, "You're everywhere." And I'm like, "Well, not really everywhere," but his point is he found the first Highland City thing that I did on this topic of how do we create an inclusive community. And I remember one of the first things that I shared there is like, "Hey, feeling scared if I went running or went somewhere because am I doing something wrong that people could look at me if I was doing something wrong?" And maybe this is over analyzing myself, but I was like, I want to be safe
Right.
and I don't want anybody else to feel unsafe,
Right.
right? And out of that experience, though, and we had like an hour and a half long conversation where they were asking me questions. I got to know our police chief in the area really well, and he and I become great friends. And he shared with me, he's like, "Ronell, because of your experiences that you shared, and me getting to know you," he's like, "I think differently."
Yeah.
He's like, "I think differently about what it must be like." He actually had me come in and talk to his whole police department, and it was interesting, but it was fascinating to see how me then accepting invitations to come and speak and being open enough to talk about my experiences and just my experiences as a child growing up, my parents having to teach me about being cautious about what I say and do and how I act in certain environments. And people are like, "Really, that happens?" I'm like, "Yeah, I still have to do that in a lot of ways." But it helped create connection with people in a way that I think it was personal. And now they know somebody. It's not just like a story they're hearing, but like, "Hey, we know you and we like you,
Yeah.
and we want to make sure that we understand this and that you feel that you're safe in our community and that you belong in our community."
Personalizes the other, whatever
Yeah,
people
yeah,
are like, this is, I'm feeling other, right?
yeah,
Um, I find this, what you said, I like, I passionately love this thing that you said, which was basically like, I got to come to the table. First of all, you're invited to the table, right?
yeah,
Let's make more of that,
yes,
right? More
yes,
people invited to the table. And then when you're at the table, you get to tell your story. And in the telling of your story, it's your unique story, right? But people are like, they build connection, right?
yeah,
Vulnerability invites vulnerability, which invites connection. And then people no longer have this idea of somebody that's something, but they have a knowledge or
yeah,
like they have like an empathy or they have like a connection, right?
yeah,
And then that becomes like the opportunity for them to be more curious in other settings and with other people. And I don't even think just people of color, right? Maybe people of different orientation or people of different
yes,
religion or whatever, right? Like I didn't die from this experience that I had. I sat down with somebody who I didn't know and that was different from me and actually grew. This could potentially happen. I feel like there's a domino uh
agreed.
potential, right?
Yeah,
Now, that's not always true, but I think every time we allow ourselves to um be curious, I love what you said, be curious about someone else's story and let them like speak their lived experience and we give them that space to do that and they give it back hopefully like you said you were able to talk to the police person, well,
police chief and
the
his
chief,
department.
yeah,
Yeah,
like and get to know him right
yep,
as a person because the police also have like a very
yeah,
like this is what we
yeah,
other right this is what
yeah,
we think of them. I think we have this problem in our society in general, right? Where like people have become more and more individually divisive, right? This is the role that I play, or this is the thing that I do, or I'm a people person, or I'm a tech person, or I'm a, this. I'm curious, like your thoughts about that in general. Like, there's a lot of people out there that are really lonely, surrounded by a lot of other people. What do you think?
It's actually, so I have a couple books here, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny, this one right here, not we're doing advertisement, but this one actually, this one actually here is great. Like, you're talking about loneliness, right? And this, Vivek Murthy was the 19th Surgeon General. And it's interesting in reading this book. And I was thinking about this idea of loneliness and the connection between, what's happening in the world that we see. And I have a fundamental belief, and actually he talks about this a lot in his book, is that because of all the acceleration and innovation and technology, like, we actually spend less time,
Yeah.
right? One of the things that he points out in the book was, um, we don't have community gathering places. And I know this is one of the things that you talk about as well, and, and love to talk about. But it's this idea of, like, because you're not connecting anymore in some place, right? Where do we do it? We do it in vehicles, generally, where we don't actually know the people. It's like a group, a group text, or a group on Facebook group or something like that, right? And it just took me back, or
Coworker.
coworker groups, right? But it's one of the things that I don't know what it was. I think it was like probably a couple of years ago when I started thinking about this a lot more. And from a religious standpoint, I bring that into my and how I think about this, because I was when I started speaking about, inclusion and belonging, and I went back and I found myself preparing for a BYU Women's Conference presentation, and I got stuck in James, in the book of James, and it's in it, and I can't remember. Well, it's James chapter 2, I believe, but he talks about this idea of the royal law.
Mm,
And I love that, like, idea of the royal. I'm like, okay, well, so what's the royal law? But if anybody knows James, this is Christ's brother. So what did he see? And I often think about, can you imagine being him and watching his brother do all the things that he did? And so James goes on to talk about how the royal law is, hey, when you see somebody in need, you help them. Send me somebody that's hungry, you give them food. Somebody naked, give them clothes. Like, you find any way you can to help them. And that's what I think about when there's so much division. Like, we spend so much time looking at the differences,
yeah.
and we don't spend enough time saying, okay, but I don't really know you, and, like, what do you need?
Yeah.
Right. Um, I Part of the things that I've been doing is, like, I talk about this. I call it it's called the inclusion equation, but essentially the idea of it was, through my lived experiences, one of the things that I've been focusing on and what I share with folks is, hey, you have to start by having exposure to people who aren't like you, right? So what does that mean? I'm not even saying talking or having dialogue.
Right.
I'm just saying, are you around people who aren't like you in any facet,
Yeah.
right?
Or reading, or
Reading,
watching, or
watching,
listening.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you do that, then do you have dialogue? And I always say, I was like, it's not, and I use these terms all the time. I was like, it's not to debate and debunk, it's to listen and to learn.
Oof.
So it's
Love
not,
that.
so it's like, the idea is, like, if you spend so much time debating, debunking, you're not learning anything, right? You're just guarding yourself and protecting what you feel was important, which is not a bad thing,
Mhm.
actually, but you're not opening yourself up to the other person to create connection,
You're
right?
certainly not perspective taking,
No,
right?
no,
Like,
definitely
which
not.
to me is the beginning of connection, right?
Yeah.
I People often say like you need to walk in somebody's shoes, and I don't even know if you have to walk in someone's shoes because that's almost impossible, right? But can I perspective take? Can I listen to your story and can I try that on?
Yeah.
And can I think about what that might look like or feel like from a really genuine place because you're telling me the story? And can you do the same?
Yeah.
Right? And then even if we don't agree, like we look at it different because of who we are,
Yep.
right? It's interesting what you say. I have been thinking a lot about this idea of wells. So stick with me for a minute. In like the scripture time and
Yep.
in ancient history, they the gathering place to me, and maybe there's something else, but I always think the stories always happened around the well. Maybe particularly because I've been single forever, the romances are around the well. People love each other. I jokingly said years ago when I was single, I was like, "We just don't have enough wells." Wells, maybe we'd be falling in love more. But this was also the place where people would gather for like water, like either the sustenance of life or actual philosophy or spiritual experiences, right? They all center around this place. And for the sake of this podcast, the like a gathering place or a belonging place, a place where people, the thing is where people gather around, right? It's hard for me to think of that in our society. I think the closest thing I can think of is like bars,
Yeah.
or like some people like to go to like clubs, maybe like dance clubs or things like that. um I think you had said something about like in England pubs,
Yeah.
right? But this idea of like we have sort of gone from this cultural, like I even think about the pioneers, circle up the wagons, dance,
Yeah.
play the music, right? Even in our ability, I mean, we still luckily still have like concerts where people come together and they do that, but we've sort of grown out of this community centered belonging into this individual, like in your home, even our neighbors, right? Like we hardly ever know our neighbors. I'm curious, Ronell, like what kinds of wells, I guess we could call them, have you seen that have made a big difference in your life and or that you've created? You talked about a few, like the soccer team,
Yeah.
right?
You know, I mean, some of the wells that I've seen, I fondly remember this. So the town that I grew up in Germany was like 530 people, right? So you literally like
Everybody knows
everybody.
me.
And when I go back there, the same people minus my family still live there, right? So like that for me is a well. And people always ask me like, well, how did like it was you just know each other. There's always these weird dynamics. I remember going back one time, I'd flown in, I mean jet lagged, and I took a nap, and they're like, Ronell, so and so's having a party, come hang out with us. And I was hanging out with them until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, right? But it's one of those like really foundational experiences I had, even to the point in this town where so my godparents had a restaurant and it was in this town. So people would always come and congregate there, right? But we would also do a Christmas party together as a town. In the restaurant, they had like a hall, so we would go and like somebody would play Santa, right? You'd put your boots out outside your house, right? And it was like, and so when I think of like, oh, this is what I grew up as a community, and I've moved different places, it's gotten less and less of that,
Mm.
right? Because it's more, to your point, it's become more individualized, right? And so when I think about creating spaces, one of the places I found that has been, in so the soccer one is definitely one of them. But I think I've also found it by trying to connect with people who may be at the same space phase in life I am, who are looking for friendship, who are looking for, you know, for example, we have a group of us that are, I think there's like 7 or 8 of us that are black men who are here. We're not necessarily all from the same religious group, but we're kind of all the same phase of like life. And it's just like having those commonalities has been really powerful because we can get together and talk about, hey, what are you doing? How can I help? Or just like talking and kind of like letting go of any type of like, or being just more open and willing to talk about things, right? I found that's something that I'm looking more for. That's why like this book that I've been reading is like, it's been so powerful for me. It's like, hey, where are those groups for me? Right? Where are those people that I can be around where I can just have open conversations and just learn and feel like and laugh. I think one of the biggest things that I feel like is missing is like the lack of like laughter and like my family. That's the other part I found as a group, which is interesting. My siblings though, we're just so sarcastic. My sister and I talk about this all the time. And like we can be so sarcastic around each other because it's like our way of just like, oh, we're being ourselves because I don't have to worry about somebody getting offended by this because I'm not trying to offend anybody.
Right.
But just let on your guard, right? And I but it's interesting you bring it up because those are like I've been able to create some of these, and some of these have been created for me, and I've been invited in. And there's opportunities I've created for others to have that circle, like young kids who need to find ways to bond with each other and kind of cool environments. But actually, if I'm honest, it's something that I've been searching for. Like it's something like learning about connection and loneliness. I realized, oh, I'm not extremely lonely, but if I were to put it like I'm somewhere along there, I'm lonely because I feel like I need more connection with people,
And I
right?
just want to say, Renelle, I don't think you're alone. So, one of the reasons why I wanted to have this podcast and sit down with people and talk to them, tell their stories, is I think that more and more people are pretty full in their lives. They have some belonging places and they are still lonely. Like, I don't think I have the corner of the market or single people for being lonely. There's plenty of married people that are lonely. There's plenty of married couples with kids that are lonely. There's plenty of older people who have lived this great big life and now they're like, now what? That are
Yeah.
lonely, right? There's people who are just starting their life that are like, how could I ever buy a house or have a this, that are like lonely, right? I truly feel, and I think we live in a society that says that you can do anything you want to do, but everyone knows it's very hard to do it, right? I often tell people, um, it's hardly anybody wants to build the train, but everybody wants to jump on the train once it's built, right?
Yeah.
So this is what I think is one of our problems in our society is that we would love to have belonging places, but we struggle with building them because it takes so much work to say like, "Hey, this is the well that I'm going to build," right? I think that's not true, but I think the perception of it is, right? Like this idea that I have to go build a nonprofit or build a business or go do something versus gather six other men that are in the situation that I am and just create an opportunity to like grow, right? The crazy thing about doing the thing that's right in your corner, like painting the
Yeah.
corner of your world, is that you can do that better than anybody else, right? Like you can create the book club, you can create the choir, you can create the men's talking group, right? Or the activity better than anybody else, right? If you, they say, build it, they will come,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So the idea of like creating wells or building connection for me is like a passion that I truly feel like um, the other part that I feel about that as a therapist is that the outcropping of that belonging, right? That group of men that you sit and talk with, whether you vent, joke, laugh, right? You're creating these, like, almost think of them as like woven pattern, right? Like, you're creating this safety and security, and that belonging also allows people to be accounted for, or the word that I like to use is to be known. Like, you're known by other
Yeah.
people, right? So the hope is that you're not going to fall through the ice. Like
Yeah.
you're not going to fall through the hole in the ice. Hopefully, right? Like there's enough people that you don't have to raise your hand and wave your arm and say, I'm really depressed or I'm having a really hard time. There's touch points and there's wells and there's belonging places to where if you're having a really hard time with your mental health or whatever it is in our lives, right? That there's enough that you're known by enough people that they can say, "Hey, how can I help you? How can I serve you?" Or that you can be that on the other side of that. "Hey, this doesn't seem right," or "How can I?" Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And then when you said the idea of being known, it made me think, a lot. I feel everybody wants to be seen. Like this idea, like, so seen maybe is not even equipment because known, I like that word better because known means that somebody actually spent time,
Yeah.
right? It's always interesting when, and, and I've been caught by doing this myself, but people always make, where are you from? And I would
Mhm.
always say, well, I'm from, I grew up in North Carolina. They're like, all right, but they don't really go any further. So I'm like, I don't feel any need to share anything else.
Right.
And so then people like the same person will hear me talking to somebody else. And somebody's like, hey, where'd you grow up? Well, that's a different question for me. I'm like, well, I grew up in Germany. I'm like, well, you didn't say that. I'm like, well, you didn't, you said, where am I from? Well, and then in America, I say I'm from the United States. That's what I
Yeah.
say. It makes me think like when I think about being known or seen, like this whole idea of like, hey, do you spend that time with people, like being very vulnerable, but also being very curious, like flexing in both those spaces? One of the things you talk about saying when you think about creating communities or creating these wells that we can go to, we can all do it. I remember during the pandemic, one of the things they thought of was like, so I like to smoke different meats.
Mhm.
So I do that. And I was like, well, we can't go to restaurants. So I went and bought a bunch of meats and smoked them for my neighborhood, like for the people and I was like, hey, I want you to have a meal as a family, but since we can't go to places, I've chosen. So you just tell me how much you need. And it wasn't, no one had to pay for anything. And we did it all like, as COVID safe as we could, but packaged up and we like delivered these things to these families so they could have a nice meal together. Right. And that was like a simple way of like creating this like little community interaction where we had this connection, but because everybody was like, we can't do anything. Everybody's stuck at home, right? But I think back to that as something so simple. And to your point, like we can do those things. Like, but it's almost like I find myself like, and if I'm honest, I find myself somebody waiting for somebody else to do
And
it.
but your honesty is, I think this is the poison. This is the thing that has like grown almost like the disease, right?
Yeah.
In our society is that um And I think sometimes, especially here, in Utah, there's this, like, a predominant religion, but there's also this belief that, like, the church and any belief, right?
Yeah.
They will build it,
Yeah.
and they haven't built it, or they haven't done it, or there's this almost this victim mentality of, like, "Well, somebody else should make me less lonely, or somebody
Yeah.
else should make me like, where's the thing, right? We have this conflict, I think, in our society of like of being content and grateful and like building and like growing and learning. It's like this super back and forth, and it's so easy to be in your own corner and to learn and grow and read books and to sort of be close to your family, right? That like this idea of creating other belonging places sometimes is like, oh, somebody else will do that. And then when nobody else does, we are where we are right now, right?
Yeah.
I think we have this very huge need to be collective, to grow together, and a huge desire, right? I'm hoping these conversations will spark a little bit of permission giving, right? Permission to start the thing that you've been thinking about doing, right? In your own corner of your world. So I love the idea of the meet. I love the idea of soccer. I love the idea of the men's group. I hope you continue
Yeah.
to like find opportunities to like grow the belonging. um we're gonna end pretty soon, but is there any particular like anything you felt like we missed in this topic that you would love to share, any quotes about this, or anything from the books that you brought that you want to make sure you leave with us?
No, well, one of the things that I've been thinking about is, um, it's interesting to think about this topic of connection. And I think one of the things that I have felt strongly about is like have to your point, like owning it more. And what does that look like, right? And so, and it's I think that creating wells isn't like location based.
Yeah.
Like some of my wells could be a group of people. It could be one to one.
Mm.
And what I found myself thinking about is like there's people I've connected with throughout my life that have had an impact on me that I know I can be myself around. And do I engage with them enough? Like I have one of my really good close friends. He lives in San Antonio, and like he actually called me today. And so every now and then he'll call me, or I'll call him. And I have another one that lives in Idaho, and another one that lives in California. And like, but I'm like, I realize like the idea of making more effort, right? Yesterday I went somewhere for myself, and I was came out of this building, and the thought in my mind was, hey, thinking, act positively.
Mm, I like that.
And it was like, okay, so what does that mean? And so like, hey, that means like, hey, that was an invitation to me. Like, you need to be like, you need to do something, right? And so that's something that I've really been thinking a lot about. And it's actually been a part of my journey over the last year. So I don't choose necessarily. I don't do New Year's resolutions. I do words. So this year's word was purpose. Like, and so the idea of like, well, what's my purpose? Find your purpose, like and all those things, right? And I've slowly come to the conclusion, like, one of the things that's come out of this journey this year has been, am I using my gifts in the ways that I need to be using them, not just for myself, but for other people.
Yeah.
And one of the things I realized, like, I'm a natural person that likes to bring people together, but I haven't been doing a lot of it, right? And I just enjoy it. Like I get a lot of energy from that, and so it just made me think about this. Is like, hey, that's one of the purposes I need to find a way to do more of, right? And it was interesting because one of my friends I went to breakfast this week with, she sent me a text afterwards like, hey, be like capital B, like be intentional,
Love that.
right?
Yeah.
So being intentional about whatever you do with your time, your life, like find that now, like you're at a point where like to be intentional. And so all these things are kind of coalesced together in this idea of like, yeah, spend the time doing things that really matter.
And can I just add, Ronell? And this comes from my therapy background. A lot of people are confused about self care. They think it's like, go get the massage, go take the
Yeah.
time. Believe, me, Kylee Shields, also as a therapist, believe that self care is the thing that's scratching behind your head that you know you should do more of that you're not doing.
Yeah.
So when I hear you say this is my gift, this is my thing, that I should probably do some more of, that to me is self-care,
Yeah.
right? And if it truly is the thing that like lights your battery or like fills your cup or whatever the analogy you want, then it will be it will give back, right? It might feel at the beginning like, oh, this is going to be hard or this is going but the reality is you'll get way more back than you put into it, right?
Yes.
And I think this is the idea of like, I'm going to use my voice, like your voice, right? I'm going to use my voice in the unique way that I can. I might be uncomfortable sometimes because you don't want to be the speaker of the people of color in Utah. But here's the reality, like, who is if you're not, right?
Yes.
Who's not going to like, we need people to sit at the tables that have their story from their unique place and create that space, right? Over and over again, unfortunately, right? Like, continuing to be able to. So I love this idea of like, part of who I think we were always meant to be and part of being known, right, is to recognize like this is something that I can offer. And I just want to say to anybody who's listening, it doesn't have to be big and it doesn't have to cost a lot of money and it doesn't have to take a ton of time because these are the things, time, money, right?
Yes.
That like that stop us. There's a set of books that I read years ago by Sterling Sill. They're called Leadership. They're so good, by the way, I recommend. But one of the lines that I underlined in the books, he says that most ideas die en route.
Interesting.
Like the idea, I want to write a book, but I never write it. Like I want to start a podcast, but I don't start it. Or I think that I should do this thing, but then you don't do that thing. that that all it takes is to just move just one level past that, right? And make the call, invite the people over, do the thing. I think that we don't need a whole bunch of big wells. We just need a lot of people doing small belonging places, right? I think as we weave ourselves together, that also creates safety, right? It also
Yeah.
creates belonging has an outcropping of resilience. Belonging has an outcropping of like positive mental health, right? It's the anecdote, I think, to like addiction, all of that, right? The things that are like enslaving our souls and our society, right? I think the solution, and maybe this is basic, but I think it's true, right? Is that like if I have more belonging, then I can right? Then I think we lose some of that sense of like loneliness because we have things and people and places that we can go do and
Yeah.
be. Yeah.
It's actually one of the things when you asked the question too, and what you've been sharing kind of made me think about. So North Carolina has this motto, and actually I keep always I wear a wristband that has it on it,
Love it.
and the motto is to be rather than to seem. And the reason I love it is because it reminds me of, well, like, hey, if you can seem like something, which in my mind is like you're pretending, you're not actually being your full self or doing the thing fully, right? And I often think about it, like just what you're saying is like, it doesn't mean you have to do something grand, but just go be. Like, go do that thing that you feel like you can do that can actually bring, create those wells, right? And to your point, it can be something so simple, and it actually could be, hey, maybe you're being invited into a well that you may not want to be a part of, but you're like, hey, maybe you should be a part of that well.
Yeah. What can I contribute?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. Like,
And I think there's a lot of that happens, and I find myself in a scenario like that right now where it's like, oh, I'm being asked to be a part of this well, and do I want to do that, right? And so it just reminds me of like, it's one thing I often say it's one thing to talk the talk, but now you got to walk the walk, right? And you have to put the action into it. And I think that I love what you're saying though. I think this idea of like creating these wells, it doesn't have to be massive. It doesn't have to be thousands of people. It could just be, I mean, what is it that I feel like I can do, and what can we do as a communities, like as individuals, to do that? 'Cause I think that's a missing part. Like people do want connection. I think we even need more of it, right? And one of the things you said earlier is like there's so much division, and one of the things that we have all the time. I think we have that because people don't really know each other.
yeah.
Division actually always equates to me that you actually care less about people. You care more about yourself, and so then it becomes more of this like, okay, I'm going to put you on opposite sides, right? But I think the more time we can find things that we're either like places that we can be together in, where it's just you being, yourself, it creates that opportunity.
Yeah.
It makes it possible for us to connect in those ways that I think we all want, but are scared to kind of to act on or pursue because we're like, okay, will I be accepted in? And actually, one of the things I've learned that I've gotten old, like I don't even, like, it might sound bad, but I'm not one of those people that cares so much about. Actually, I've never actually cared much about what people think of me, and it's not in an arrogant way. It's like, hey, I need to make sure that I'm good for me, my personal beliefs with God, and if I feel like I'm good with God, then hopefully I'm acting in a way that's respectful of other people. And so other people can have a perspective or a thought, and I take it where I feel like, oh yeah, there's things I can always learn from other people. But I don't ever go in, I don't ever have a sense of like, oh, I need to worry about how people like their judgment of me or their thoughts on me. Cause I'm like,
Right, but something I learned by talking to you today is that it does matter to you how people feel around you,
yes,
right?
yeah. And
Yeah.
that's huge. That to me is different. And I always, I always catch myself when I've done something and people that have had this experience with me, they'll tell you. But I would go back and be like, "Hey, I felt this. Is that what I communicated? Because if I did, I'm sorry." And they're like, "No, no, 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 not even at all." But I think it's super important because I think the more we can create spaces where people feel comfortable and if we're cognizant of it, then it creates those opportunities to connect.
Yeah, things that I'm hearing from you right now, be curious.
Yeah.
Like be a curious person. Create rooms at the table for people to share their story, right? And you'll be surprised at like the connection that show up authentically, right? Like, and I love that we share the in common idea of just like simply being where you are in your corner and like making a difference in the world. My last question for you
Okay.
before we end is for you to feel more known or for you to feel more seen or to feel more belonging, what do you think would need to happen?
Oh wow, that's a good question.
Or to be less lonely when you're talking about
Yeah, it's when you ask the question, the thought that came into my mind was being more open and willing to engage.
it? Okay.
And it's not like I'm not, but the thought that came to my mind was like, hey, just do it. Like, don't, because I can really kind of be a recluse and isolate myself. People probably don't think that, but I'm like, no, I really can.
Yeah.
But there's so much that I feel like I can contribute. And over the last probably several months, people have said this to me like, hey, you can do so much more. Or like, we would love to hear more of your voice. And I was like, okay. Like you talked about writing, you said something about writing a book. Somebody's been asking me for a year to write a book. And I'm like, I don't really have time for that. I've made excuses. But the thought, like, do it. Like when
Yeah.
you ask, like, don't be afraid to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what will help create more wells because I think there's, when you're open, people then connect with you.
Your story matters.
Yeah.
And the minute that you don't think your story matters, that is where we break
Yeah.
from the connection, right?
Yeah.
Well, I hope we get to see your book in the future and see you more around talking and using the gifts that you have. I appreciate you. Thank you for your time
Hi,
tonight.
thank you for having me. Thank you.